Before I begin, I would like very much to thank the organizers of this conference, Cristi and Alina, and everyone who has put so much thought, work, and passion into making it the extraordinary happening it is. As new as I am to the Power of Storytelling experience, I could tell from the very first day that it was going to be something really special. It's particularly meaningful for me to be here today in my birthplace, Bucharest. I recently calculated that I left Romania 40 years ago in 1986. When I told my husband this, he said, "That's longer than the Cold War." He then helpfully added, "At some point, you're older than actual historical eras." He's still alive. I don't think anyone has a simple story, but when you grow up an immigrant, you are profoundly aware of the ways your life does not fit into the patterns around you. You are always conscious of the fact that other people's givens are not your own. My maternal grandfather, Mircea Trifu, was Jewish. Well, Mircea Trifu was after he changed his name. This sufficed for the state of Israel to purchase my exit permission to leave and that of my parents back in 1986. It's a policy I think some of you know something about, and it suited both its government's and the Romanian government's plans for their ethnic minorities. Once set up in an absorption center for immigrants, my parents realized they had jumped from the frying pan into the fire, or as we said, from the lake into the well. They set to work on their next migration, this time to Canada. I would go on to emigrate 2 more times on my own. The first time was to the United States for my doctorate in medieval studies, and for my first job in Dallas, which was to the great excitement of our entire diasporic Romanian community, which told me to look out for JR. And then I moved to Germany so that my husband and I could live and work in the same country. The first 2 migrations were like with 2 suitcases each. The second 2 migrations were very luxurious. I tell this personal history because it left certain marks on me. By the time we arrived in Canada, my parents had reached one of the safest countries on the planet, but they could not internalize that safety. My mother, scarred by the 1977 Bucharest earthquake and the looming prospect of war in the Middle East, developed a series of phobias: flying, heights, terrorism anywhere on earth, plague. My father, academically brilliant, but incapable of adapting to the loss of authority he had enjoyed in Romania, lost one job after another throughout my teen years. I'm going to put in a sentence for the Romanians here. The bosses were always dobitoci. Translate that for the others, please. As for me, I grew up with a basic level of skepticism towards every ideology, even the ones that appealed to me. I knew how quickly democracies could end and utopian visions could turn to dust. I don't know whether it was because of my parents' difficulties or due to some ancestral belief in the power of the evil eye, but I also came to believe that hope was dangerous. In fact, I made a proper discipline out of never hoping for anything. Okay, have any of you done the following mental trick? You want something. You have a wish, a vision of how things could be better. You begin to imagine this ideal state, how much lighter things could be, how you could bloom, and then you catch yourself. You know this is asking for trouble. You force yourself to picture all the worst possible outcomes. It's better to be prepared, better to imagine the catastrophe with all its rubble, and then just be pleasantly surprised if it doesn't come along. Sometimes the only thing to do with catastrophic thinking is to find out what people actually do during a catastrophe. A year or 2 into my job in Texas, I organized a conference panel on the role of arts and humanities in challenging historical times. This is what became the book Room Under Fire. It was 2010, and it was already commonplace at the time to talk about a crisis in the humanities. And usually what was meant by this phrase was a lack of tenure-track jobs for holders of North American humanities PhDs. This was certainly a crisis in employment, but I wondered if it was fair to call it a crisis in the humanities. I suspected that it was precisely in times of crisis that the humanities are the most vital. Now, I am a medievalist. I specialize in literature written in England between the years 700 and 1500, give or take a century. I never went to school in Romania, and my knowledge of my home country has mostly been acquired through stories from my family, my family's friends in the diaspora, and my occasional visits back. And these stories went something like this. If the censors caught you criticizing Ceausescu, it could mean imprisonment or death. So playwrights and novelists developed subtle ways of communicating with the audience, and part of the pleasure was catching what the censor didn't. Or, we were in Timișoara and would sometimes get books from outside. They were passed around high school, and each of us had exactly one night to spend with a book. I'd pretend to go to sleep and then read under the covers with a flashlight all night. Or, my father-in-law was in political prison and being tortured. To stay sane, he and his cellmate taught each other foreign languages. My father-in-law later became a professional translator using the English he had learned in prison. I felt that my background gave me some perspective on the uses of art and the humanities that many of my North American academic friends didn't have. But I decided to see if I could find some evidence to show them what I knew through oral tradition. I dug up as many memoirs written by Romanian political prisoners from the late 1940s to the early 1960s as I could. These victims of the so-called Romanian Gulag came in all flavors. They were professors and priests and teenagers, Greek Orthodox, Catholics, Jews, out-of-favor communists, and fascist legionaries. Although one of the fascist legionaries was named Itzik Goldenberg, so I don't know how accurate the documents were. They were economists, artists, scholars of law. Many were university students. Many were tortured and forced to torture one another in return. I read whatever I could find, searching for those moments when the authors described how they held on to their humanity, even when it was under attack. The prisoners I read about used many strategies to stay sane. They taught one another languages, played chess, worked out math problems. They communicated through codes, tapping Morse on the walls, or squeaking it with a chair, or coughing it out. They recited poetry, they prayed, and many turned to literature, composing plays, memoirs, and poems in their minds when in solitary confinement, sharing stories with one another when interned together. Juana Orlea, the pen name of Maria Ioana Cantacuzino, was arrested at age 16 in 1952. In her memoir, she describes how at one point she was moved to a cell with a number of older women. These women had developed a rigorous daily program for themselves. The morning was for gymnastics, chores, and language learning. In the afternoon, she writes, we took turns telling a story. Made-up stories, memories from our reading, from movies. We sang or recited poems, and like all starving prisoners, we went right on to recipes. I thought about her memoir in particular a lot in the early days of the pandemic, when we were all coming up with daily plans for ourselves, right? Magdalena Kanchikov's memoirs featured a similar recollection. Quote, sometimes I recount books. The younger girl calls them cakes. The more captivating the books, the higher the cake becomes. It becomes a tiered cake with whipped cream. Dorothy Sayers and Agatha Christie will never know the joy Lord Peter and Poirot gave my companions over the years, allowing them to forget their misery for a few hours. Stories, I began to see, were a lot like food. They could keep prisoners alive, and perhaps just as important, they could allow them to feel pleasure again. Reading these memoirs taught me a great deal. I learned from them that we all have access to creativity, to storytelling, to strategies for survival. Many of the political prisoners whose books I read were highly educated, but in the prison cell, it wasn't so important whether they were retelling the story of Tristan and Isolde or of a movie they'd seen. The pleasures of art and study could take them out of prison for a while. It reconnected them to a past and often to a future. When you exchange recipes, which is, by the way, something a lot of prisoners all over the world have done, in both concentration camps, POW camps, prisons, or teach one another languages, you imagine a reality in which you might possibly use those skills. I did not have these lessons consciously in mind when I met my own crises. At some level, though, they must have been helping me along. In 2014, I was in Berlin on a research fellowship. My task was to finish the monograph that would secure me tenure at my job in Texas. It was an all-or-nothing business. Complete the work on time, and I would have security for life. Fail to write or publish the book, and I would have to find myself a new career. Still, I had time and financial support. I was very lucky. However, I also had a baby, and I had just been through a severe and untreated postpartum depression, which by that point had mellowed into writer's block. I spent day after day sitting at my desk, willing one or two sentences to come out. They did not. I turned to photocopying articles, which I could do while listening to music on my iPod. I did a lot of photocopying that year. Desperate to begin writing, I did something I never thought I would. I signed up for a creative writing class through an organization called The Reader Berlin. The class was taught by Claire Wigfall, a British short story writer, and it was kind of hilarious because she wrote these really dark stories in which children get brutalized, but she was very angelic looking and highly pregnant at the time. It was really weird. I didn't think of myself as a creative writer, but I was hoping against hope that something in this course would loosen me up. Claire explained to us that she had begun teaching creative writing to kindergarten-aged children. She developed all sorts of fun little games to get them going, and then she tried these games on adults. About 8 of us sat in her living room once a week and looked at postcards with secrets on them, picked buttons out of a box, asked each other questions about characters, and then wrote feverishly without any hesitation. It felt as though Claire had cracked my head open. At my desk at the university, try as I might, I could not put a single sentence together. But in her apartment, without any goal in mind, or pressure, or high stakes, the words just came along. I always tell people I can't make things up, and with my background, I really don't have to. But when Claire led us through a writing game, a host of characters appeared in my mind, fully formed. One day after I left the class, I went to a Thai restaurant in the neighborhood for lunch. I was waiting for the curry to arrive when I felt a powerful urge to write. So I pulled out my pen and notebook, and I began. And I didn't stop for the meal. I barely even stopped to breathe. In fact, I wrote for 3 days straight. I think I even remember writing on the toilet until the essay was done. It wasn't an academic monograph, and it had nothing to do with the Middle Ages. I wrote about my father's obsession with making his own wine in our Ontario garage. I wrote about how he tried to hold on to his sense of Romanian identity and to his connection to his own father through this massive yearly production of alcohol. I wrote about how this became the central event of my family's life together. I wrote about the time my father decided that the Italians, who had the machines which would crush the grapes, were not very good at maintaining their machines. So we had to crush our grapes ourselves, at which point my 2 grandmothers and I imported from Romania, stood around garbage cans and squeezed industrial quantities of grapes with our hands. I wrote about how he, an engineer and once a professor at the Polytechnic here, designed and built his own still so that he could make his own tsuika, or plum brandy. Incidentally, this was highly illegal in Ontario. I wrote about the various Romanian men who began to ferment their own fruits into must, and about how they would bring it to our garage and sit around under one yellow light bulb for hours. They smoked, they talked, they drank, and they watched the tsuika falling out of the still drop by drop. I also wrote about the ways that my family started to fall apart as my father kept losing jobs and scheming about other ways of making money. I wrote about the regular arguments over dinner, fueled by that homemade wine. Finally, I wrote about how my father pushed us all away, but held on to his beloved bottle. The writer's block loosened up soon after, too. For years, I had been convinced that structure and discipline were the answer to my problems. You have to understand, since I was 14, I have made elaborate 5-year plans for the future. And because I always have to assume I will be disappointed, I have to make elaborate backup plans, B and C and D, so that I won't be taken by surprise when my hopes are dashed. Naturally, I always thought that if I couldn't concentrate enough to write, I had to try harder. I had to glue my butt to the seat every day, keep track of how many words I'd written and how much I still had to do, and face that screen if it killed me. But what I learned in Claire Wigfall's living room was that there was value, no, not just value, there was life in creative exercises not aimed at a particular goal. Claire's classroom was a kind of playground in which we engaged our senses and were as focused as little kids. Because her prompts involved multiple steps, often unpredictable ones, I couldn't plan ahead. I had to stay in the moment and focus on the task at hand. What came out was unexpected, unpredictable. Sure, her exercises got me writing again. That was why I'd signed up. But in the process, I also learned there were parts of me I did not yet know about, and some of them were ready to emerge. Out of all the kinds of hope I've allowed myself, this one is the most delicious. The hope that I was not trapped by what I could already imagine. Now, this should be the end of my story here, a happy ending. I finished that scholarly book. I got a job in Germany. I eventually earned tenure. A job in life, and even better for that immigrant kid who moved around so much, security. In fact, as a German civil servant, I gained just about as much security as it is possible to have in this ridiculous world. I clearly did not realize how much I had left to learn. Last year, I had 2 dreams come true. I had been trying to sell a nonfiction book on proposal for approximately 8 years. Lana's right, by the way, just write your books. It was a marathon of failure, and at that point, I had given up hope. I was clearly never going to be a trade book author. However, I'm stubborn, so I wrote one more proposal just to force those stupid editors to reject me again. It sold in about half a week. I then went to Paris for a guest professorship. I was on top of the world. The years since the start of the pandemic, as they have been for so many of us, had been challenging. My mother had suffered a series of mental and physical crises, culminating in the diagnosis of early dementia. My grandmother had the usual kind of timely dementia. One of my closest friends died of cancer, which could have been avoided had his doctor taken him seriously. These were just the highlights. But in February of 2025, I felt I could put this misery out of mind. I was energized, I had done my back physiotherapy, I had clever editors for my book, and I was going to Paris. I went to Paris alone, actually. It was even better. On the first weekend there, don't show this to my husband, okay? On the first weekend there, I took an art course. I'd never done any painting in my life and was quite sure I could not draw. But it was abstract art, and I thought I could muddle through and maybe practice the language a little bit, get to know some people. I fell utterly, completely in love. I immediately went out and bought watercolors and brushes, woke up every morning and painted bright blobs. I thought about shapes and colors when I went to sleep. I bought gouache and acrylic paints and markers and pencils, and I experimented with those too. I've spent a lot of time in my life planning for bad things to happen to me, but it turns out I was unprepared for good ones. When I returned home to Bonn, my brain no longer worked. It was the familiar story. I sat at my computer all day, willing myself to write 3 sentences, failing. The semester began, and I cried every day of the first week, sometimes in front of colleagues, which is really fun. I took naps between each class to keep going, and then laid down in my office for an hour after teaching to get the energy to make it home. It was a 15-minute bus ride. I had colds for weeks. I had the one single doctor in all of Germany who doesn't believe in writing people off sick. So I kept teaching and going to meetings until I no longer knew what day or week it was. I felt very, very, very ashamed for having won the lottery of life and being too weak to make it to the end of the day. Mostly, I felt I was just inventing new ways of letting people down. But here was the really strange part. When I went to the dining room table, which at this point was half covered with my art supplies, I was calm. I sketched, I doodled, I collaged, I messed around with crayons. I would get an idea for something to do, and there was no inner critic telling me it was a bad idea. There was like a direct connection between my intention and my hand. When I write, even when I'm in the best possible flow, there's always this little editorial voice that intervenes to deflect my first thoughts. When making art, I did not have that. And I could tell that some pieces were better looking than others, but it did not make me love them more. I loved everything I made. In fact, sometimes I loved the ugliest pieces the most. So here I was, and here I still am, trying to figure out what to do next. How to recover my old self, if I can or even want to recover my old self. The odd thing is, this time, I feel I received the gift I needed before the crisis hit. It was once again a gift of play, the freedom of a child's creativity. It was a key to unlock the prison of the present. We've heard a lot about the meaning of hope this weekend. As a medievalist, I have to go back to the sources. I looked up the Old English etymology of hope. I know you were waiting for this, like, where's the dictionary work, people? The verb hopian could mean to look with expectation towards something, but it could also mean to trust or to have confidence. So in Old English, people often use it for God or paradise. You hope on God or hope in God. Likewise, the Latin verb sperare could also mean to trust or to believe. I still don't know how to hope for good things to happen in the future or for the world to get better. I know there are people in camps and war zones and prisons whose hopes of survival will be disappointed. And that's no matter how many poems they recite or write. Personal crises will keep happening too. Marriages will fail. People will lose jobs and their health. Their expectations of positive outcomes will be disappointed. More storms will come. But here is what creative play has taught me. Maybe hope is not a wish for the future, but confidence in ourselves. Maybe it is the faith that we can meet the challenges to come while preserving something essential in our hearts. Call it our dignity, call it our freedom, call it our basic human right to beauty and pleasure and delight. For myself, art gives me the hope that I might not know everything yet, either about the world or about myself. My task is to keep entering spaces where unexpected things can happen. The painting studio, the writing classroom, even the kitchen. These are my laboratories of hope. And so to close, I'd like to ask you to join me in transforming, just for a minute, this beautiful space into a laboratory. I'm hoping you will join me in a little scribbling exercise. If you're willing, could you pull out a piece of paper and a pen or pencil? So when you're ready, you could just start by making a few circles with your hand, just to warm up your hand. On the paper. Like this, on the paper. Because you always need a little warm up. Circles, yeah, just little circles. Just scribble or whatever you want on the piece of paper, just to make a little mess to begin with. And then if you're still willing, once you're warmed up, you could find a fresh page or choose to stay on the page you're on. Close your eyes and draw a face. You could do it in one line, or you can lift your pen off the paper and put it back down, however you like. You could do it a few times too, if you like. I take it some of you have looked at the results already. So now what I invite you to do, again, if you wish, is take up your pen or pencil with your non-dominant hand. And draw a face, and I leave it up to you. You can have your eyes closed or you can have your eyes open. And with that exercise, I will thank you for your attention, and I really hope you're having fun.